All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we are going deep, deep into the fascinating world of Chinese characters. I'm so excited to be digging into this with you. RSU.pdf, right? That's our source material for today's deep dive. Looks incredible.
Oh, it is. Really a gold mine of information.
So, are we talking like the whole history of Chinese characters? Because that sounds like, well, a lot.
We are going back in time, way back, but don't worry, we can hit the highlights, focus on the key moments that really changed how these characters developed.
Okay, because I have to admit, I'm already feeling a little overwhelmed just thinking about it. Like, where do you even begin with a system this complex? Thousands of years of history, right?
Thousands, yeah. It can feel daunting. But think of it like this. We're going to trace how those ancient symbols evolved. It's a journey through time. Almost like those archaeologists uncovering fossils.
Okay, I like that. A linguistic fossil dig. So, where's our first stop on this big site?
First stop, we're going way back to the Shang Dynasty, talking about oracle bone script. Can you imagine finding messages on tortoise shells and animal bones?
That's wild. Are we talking about like actual pictures then? Like the characters look like what they represent?
They really do. I
Yeah.
mean, early forms for sun and moon, they actually resemble those celestial bodies.
Hmm.
Pretty straightforward, right? But of course, as society started to get more complex, well, the writing system had to keep up.
Right, like things couldn't just stay simple pictures forever. So, what came next?
We enter the Bronze Age.
Hmm.
The characters start to shift. They become a little more abstract, more stylized, for efficiency.
Okay, so sun and moon are less like detailed drawings now and more like symbols, I guess.
Exactly. And it's not just the sun and the moon. Think about tiger and horse, those characters too. They started to look less like a picture you might draw and more like, well, a simplified symbol.
I can see why they did that, but I have to ask, all this change, all this evolution, didn't it get confusing? How did people even keep up?
Well, it's important to remember that we're talking about a vast area, right? Ancient China wasn't always this unified empire we think of today. So during the Warring States period, each state, well, they kind of developed their own way of writing.
Oh, wow. So it's like the language itself was almost breaking apart, kind of like how dialects sometimes become totally different languages.
It's a good analogy. It was a time of tremendous creativity, but also potential chaos. You can imagine the challenge of communication.
Yeah, talk about a communication breakdown. So how did they solve that problem?
Well, that's where the Qin dynasty comes in. Emperor Qin Shi Huang, famous for unifying China, he imposed a writing unity policy.
That makes sense. Standardize the writing, standardize the language, unify the empire. It's like controlling the very building blocks of thought, in a way.
Exactly. And to do that, they needed a new official script. Enter the Great Seal script.
The Great Seal script. So that was like version 2.0 of the writing system then. A total overhaul.
A major turning point, for
Yeah.
sure. And it was largely thanks to Li Si, key figure in the Qin court. He spearheaded the effort to merge all those different writing styles that had sprung up during the Warring States period.
Wow. Can you imagine the task? Trying to create order out of that linguistic chaos.
It was a monumental undertaking, but it laid the foundation for everything that followed.
So what happened to the Great Seal script? Did it just fade away?
Actually, it evolved further, leading to the Small Seal script. It was even more elegant and refined. And guess what? It's still used today in art, and for seals.
Oh, wow, that's cool. So the writing system's already getting fancy, huh? But I bet it wasn't very practical for everyday use.
Well, you're right about that. As the empire grew, they needed something faster, more efficient for, all that bureaucracy, all that record keeping.
Right. I can only imagine all those poor scribes hunched over scrolls for hours.
Exactly. They needed a script that was easier to write quickly. And that's where clerical script enters the picture. Straight, angular strokes, much faster, much more practical.
So from picture-like symbols to stylized scripts and now to something more streamlined, the writing system was definitely keeping pace with the times.
It was. And eventually, this evolution led us to the script we see most often today. Regular script, also known as Heeple. You'll find it in books, newspapers, everywhere.
Ah, finally, something I recognize. But it sounds like this whole journey from ancient symbols to the characters we see today, it's just the tip of the iceberg, right?
Oh, absolutely. We've only just scratched the surface. To really understand how these characters work, we need to delve into the 6 principles of character formation. The Lu Shu, as they're known in Chinese.
6 principles. That sounds a little intimidating, but okay, bring it on. Let's crack the code of Chinese characters.
You're ready. It's going to be a wild ride. We'll see how these principles unlock the secrets of character construction.
All right, so we've seen how Chinese characters evolved over centuries, from those ancient oracle bones to the scripts we use today. But now it's time to really crack the code. 6 principles of character formation, you said. The Lucio. Okay, help me out here. Where do we even begin?
Let's start simple with the very foundation, pictograms.
Pictograms. Okay, so back to those oracle bone characters,
Yeah.
like sun and moon actually looking like, well, the sun and the moon.
Exactly. It's the most intuitive principle, really. A stylized drawing that represents the object itself.
Makes sense. But I'm guessing it gets more complicated than that, right? I mean, you can't just draw a picture for every word, can you? What about abstract ideas?
Good point. You need a way to represent concepts, too, and that's where ideograms come in.
Ideograms. All right, give me an example. How do you draw an idea?
Think about the characters for up and down. They're not pictures of a thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But just a simple line pointing in a direction.
Oh, okay, so it's like those universal symbols we see everywhere. Arrows, that kind of thing.
Exactly. It's about conveying the concept, not a literal image.
Clever. But what about more complex ideas, Ideas that you can't just represent with a line or a simple picture.
Well, then you start combining those simple elements. That's our third principle. Compound ideograms.
Compound ideograms. All right. So we're taking those building blocks and putting them together, like language Legos. Give me an example.
Sure. Imagine the character for tree. Now, put two of them together. What do you get?
A forest.
A forest. You see, the meaning's built right into the combination of those simpler characters.
Okay, I'm starting to get it, but I have to imagine it gets even trickier. I mean, Chinese has so many words, so many characters, you can't possibly create a unique combination for everything, right?
You're right. It would be impossible. And that's where our fourth principle comes in, and this one is super important. It's called phonosemantic compounds.
Phonosemantic compounds. Okay, that sounds a little complicated.
It's really not that bad. Basically, you're combining a meaning component with a sound component. The meaning component is called a radical. It gives you a clue about the general category of the word, and then the sound component tells you, well, how to pronounce it.
Okay, so it's like a two-part code. You've got the meaning clue, the radical, and then the pronunciation clue. Give me an example.
Sure, let's take the character for river. See that left part?
Yeah.
The three little squiggles next to each other? That's the radical for water.
Oh, okay, so that tells me it's something to do with water.
Exactly. And then the right part, that gives you the pronunciation.
Wow, it's like each character has a built-in dictionary. So cool. But how do you keep all these combinations straight? I mean, there must be tons of possibilities, right?
There are, but that's where our fifth principle comes in. Mutual explanations, or hie.
Mutual explanations. So now we're getting into the philosophy of language.
A little bit. But the basic idea is that characters with shared elements, either in meaning or pronunciation, they can kind of illuminate each other. It's about recognizing the relationships between characters.
Okay, so it's not just about memorizing individual characters, it's about seeing those connections. That makes the system feel a lot less random, more like a web of meaning. All right, one principle left. What's the final piece of this linguistic puzzle?
Borrowed characters, or breache. This one highlights just how adaptable the Chinese writing system really is.
Borrowed characters. So what are we borrowing from exactly?
Existing characters. They're used to represent words that don't have their own written form yet.
Ah, okay, so it's kind of like using acronyms in English. We're repurposing familiar elements for something new.
Precisely. Think about it. When new concepts or technologies emerge, they need a way to be written down. So they borrow a character that had a similar sound. It's a very ingenious way to keep the writing system flexible and dynamic.
So we've gone from pictograms, those simple pictures, to ideograms representing ideas, to combining those elements, adding sound components, and even borrowing characters. It's amazing how much complexity is packed into each character.
It is. And these six principles work together to create a system that's both incredibly intricate and incredibly adaptable.
I have to admit, though, it still feels a bit overwhelming. All these principles, radicals, sound components. How do you even begin to decipher a character you've never seen before?
Well, remember the concept of arna from our source material, deciphering meaning from form. It's like being a detective, right? You've got these six principles as your tools. You see a new character, you start analyzing. Are there any pictograms hiding in there? Does it look like a compound ideogram? Can you spot any radicals that give you a clue about the meaning?
Okay, I'm starting to see how it all comes together. You're using those clues, those patterns, to unlock the meaning. It's like a puzzle.
Exactly. And the more you expose yourself to Chinese characters, the more intuitive it becomes. You start to recognize those connections, those echoes of meaning across different characters.
But what about those times when a character's form changes over time? Doesn't that mess things up? I mean, we've seen how scripts evolved, became simplified, more stylized. What happens when those changes obscure the original meaning?
That's a great question. And you're right, it can happen. In fact, our source material talks about this phenomenon called ichai, which essentially means erroneous transformation. These are changes that happen over time due to, you know, misinterpretations, simplifications, and they can lead to a loss of that original semantic logic.
Oh, so it's like a historical game of telephone, but with characters. Interesting. Are there common ways that these erroneous transformations happen?
There are a few classic examples. Sometimes you have characters with similar shapes that get confused, like a character originally containing the element for cauldron might end up being written with the element for shell because, well, they look kind of alike.
I see. So it's a visual mix-up. What else?
Sometimes the original metaphor behind a character gets lost. Like, let's say you have a character that was initially based on a visual metaphor. Over time, that metaphor might become less clear, more abstract.
Okay, can you give me an example? I'm intrigued.
Sure. Think about the character for Mulberry. It originally depicted a tree, right, with branches. But over time, people started to see those branches as three hands, and the way the character was written, the way it was perceived, it shifted. The connection to that original meaning, that visual metaphor, it faded.
So even though the character is still around, its meaning has drifted away from its roots. Wow, it's fascinating, but it also makes understanding those ancient texts even more challenging.
It definitely adds a layer of complexity. But that's also part of what makes studying Chinese characters so rewarding. It's like being a cultural archaeologist, uncovering those layers of meaning buried within each stroke.
It's not just memorizing symbols, it's about understanding their history, their evolution. It's about those aha moments when you finally crack the code.
Exactly. And speaking of aha moments, remember our talk about phonetic loan characters? Those characters borrowed based on their sound. Understanding that concept is super important for reading those old texts, because the same character might represent different words depending on the context.
Right, because the original meaning might have shifted or been lost through those erroneous transformations. It's like a giant linguistic puzzle, and each piece, each character, each principle contributes to the overall picture.
You got it. And that actually brings us to a distinction that's probably familiar to you. Simplified versus traditional characters.
Ah, yes, the great debate, simplified versus traditional. I feel like everyone's heard those terms, but I have to admit I don't really understand the whole story. It's not just about like two different fonts.
Not at all. It's a distinction that's deeply rooted in history, politics, even cultural identity. It's a fascinating story, really.
So, simplified versus traditional Chinese characters. It's one of those things you hear about, but I never really understood the full story. Like, it's more than just two different ways of writing the same characters, right?
Oh, it's way more than that.
Yeah.
We're talking about a complex history, a lot of cultural and political factors at play. To really grasp it, we need to go back to mid-20th century China. You know, the newly established People's Republic of China. They had this big problem, widespread illiteracy, so they decided to tackle it head on.
By simplifying the characters, make them easier to learn, I guess.
Exactly. They created a whole system, a standardized set of simplified characters, reduced the number of strokes in a lot of characters, got rid of some of the complex components.
It makes sense. Make the writing system more accessible, more people can learn to read and write. But I have to wonder, did they lose something in the process? You know, all those layers of meaning we've been talking about?
That's the big debate, isn't it? The trade-off. Simplified characters made the language easier to learn, but some argue it was at the cost of cultural continuity. You see, traditional characters, they have this longer history, those intricate forms. They preserve those visual metaphors, those connections to the past.
It's like on one hand, you have accessibility, ease of use. On the other, you have tradition, history. Is that why places like Hong Kong and Taiwan still use traditional characters?
That's a big part of it. You know, for them, it's about cultural heritage, a visual link to their identity. And it's not just them. A lot of overseas Chinese communities feel the same way.
It's fascinating how writing, something we often take for granted, can be so tied to identity, to culture. So are we saying that one system is better than the other, simplified versus traditional?
It's not about better or worse.
Mhm.
Honestly, both systems have their strengths and weaknesses. Simplified characters make the language more accessible. Traditional characters preserve those historical and cultural links. It really comes down to individual and community choices.
And that brings us back to what we've been saying all along. Language is always evolving, always changing. It's shaped by everything around it, from politics to culture to technology.
Exactly. And this whole deep dive into Chinese character evolution really highlights that. We've seen how these characters transformed over centuries, reflecting all those changes in society.
It's been an amazing journey. From those ancient pictograms on oracle bones, to the standardized scripts of empires, to this modern-day debate about simplification, I feel like I've learned so much.
Me too. And really, we've only just scratched the surface.
That's the thing about language, I guess. There's always more to explore, always more to discover.
Exactly. And for our listeners out there, I hope this deep dive has inspired you to keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning, because every Chinese character has a story to tell.
So don't just see them as abstract symbols. See them as windows into history, into culture, into the incredible power of language. Happy exploring, everyone.